What kind of joke is this, old man? Lieutenant Evan Mercer's shout cut through the crowded mess hall. At the exact moment he slammed the plate onto the counter, the metal clatter sent a stabbing through the room. He leaned in, dripping with contempt. You can't even melt cheese. You're old. What else can you even do anymore? Frank Calder, 82 years old, stood still like a stone carved by decades of storms, yet never broken by them. His thin, weathered hand tightened slightly around the spatula. He spoke only one sentence, so calm, it made several younger sailors glance at each other. If you have a complaint, Lieutenant, send it to the right place. Mercer let out a sharp, mocking laugh and flicked his hand toward him. But in that brief movement, he accidentally brushed against the faded patch on Frank's shoulder, a Thunderbird insignia so old and obscure no one on the ship truly recognized it. Frank placed his hand over it gently, as if shielding an old memory, and said slowly, "Some things cost a lifetime to keep." The mess hall fell silent instantly. The air thickened heavy enough to press on every chest. And then from the hallway came urgent, pounding footsteps, followed by a voice that made every sailor jolt upright. "Clear the passageway, XO coming down." No one understood why a tiny kitchen dispute had triggered such a powerful reaction. But they were about to learn, and that revelation would change the way the entire ship looked at one quiet old man behind the galley line. If you believe that true courage isn't found in the sound of gunfire, but in the quiet strength of those who have lived through war, subscribe to brave veteran stories and help us preserve the memories, dignity, and honor of the silent heroes among us. Some things take a whole lifetime to keep. As the words left his lips, Frank Calder gently placed his hand over the faded patch, as if it were a piece of himself that had been stitched there long ago. In that small moment, his calm wasn't resignation. It was a solid, unwavering silence that made those standing closest force themselves to look inward. The wooden handle of the spatula in his hand was worn smooth, marked by old scratches. He looked down at it the way one looks at an old companion, one that had stayed with him through all the years after his military service, the years he chose to live quietly, taking on small tasks, distancing himself from talk of glory or heroics. The ventilation fan groaned steadily. The distant clatter of utensils from a nearby table slowed as though being pulled under by the thickening silence. The busy mess hall suddenly felt empty, reduced to the soft breaths of those who no longer knew how to react. Frank remained exactly where he was, holding his breath, steady, his posture composed like someone who had faced chaos too many times to be rattled by it now. But deep within his mind, a shard of memory flared to life. The sea at night, black as ink, waves rising like walls before the ship's bow. The radio crackling violently as the storm ripped the signal apart. He could hear the voices of his shipmates calling his name through the static, their voices trembling under the roar of wind and the sound of metal straining in the dark. That storm didn't just bring rain and wind. It brought choices so sharp that a single miscalculation could have sent the entire task group behind him straight into the ocean's grave. And Frank, known then by the call sign Harbormaster, had held everything together with nothing but his heartbeat and sheer will. The memory flashed past like lightning. He closed his eyes for a breath, then opened them, before anyone could notice the tremor beneath the surface. He said nothing more, standing still with the quiet strength of someone who had weathered too many storms to let a young officer's careless words reach him. The patch on his shoulder, an old faded square of fabric that meant nothing to the younger sailors, reminded him of final handshakes, of lessons passed down from men who had shaped him, men he always felt he was never worthy enough to stand beside. Meanwhile, Evan Mercer still stood before him, wearing the same smirk, the same false confidence, unaware that the atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. He still believed this was just an old cook who had fumbled a simple task, unaware of the glances around him that were slowly changing from curiosity to confusion to unease. The young sailors said nothing, but they sensed something different in Frank's silence, something with weight depth and an echo that made their backs straighten almost instinctively. Frank lowered his gaze to the spatula again, tapping his finger lightly against the metal, as if counting a rhythm only he understood. Perhaps it was the rhythm of waves. Perhaps it was the footsteps of long-gone shipmates. Or perhaps it was simply the steady beat of a heart that still answered every time the past called out. Mercer still didn't realize he had stepped on something far greater than his own pride. Frank spoke no further. He simply drew in a soft breath and kept his hand over the patch, guarding a piece of his life he never intended to drag into the light. And in that stillness, another memory rose unbidden sharp, like the past itself returning to answer the disrespect he had just endured. "You look like you wandered off a retirement cruise." Mercer raised his voice loudly enough for the entire mess hall to hear. His words carried the smug confidence of a young officer who had never truly understood the weight of a life spent in service. What sounded like a simple jab sliced through the heavy silence that had just settled, cutting straight into the dignity of anyone who had ever served this country with their whole heart. A few scattered chuckles rose from a corner table but died instantly when they saw how Frank didn't react. No anger, no argument, no explanation. He simply stood there, one hand resting on the faded patch on his shoulder. And that single gesture pushed Mercer to throw out another taunt he couldn't resist. "What is that? Something you bought at a flea market?" Mercer's finger brushed the patch again, and in that instant, Frank's memories burst free like a flood held back too long. The noise of the mess hall faded. In its place rose the pitch-black sky of 1962. Wind lashing his face like steel whips. A soaked map clinging to the navigation table, its ink smeared by seawater. Radio signals choked by the roar of a storm louder than the ship's engines. And Frank, then only a young officer, forced to calculate every deviation in course with desperate precision, trying to keep the struggling task group behind him from vanishing into the ocean within minutes. He remembered the numbers scribbled under the trembling light of a dying lamp. He remembered the young faces waiting for him to guide them through a storm no one believed they could survive. And he remembered sewing that Thunderbird patch onto his sleeve, not for glory, but as a vow to himself that he would keep the promise entrusted to him by the men whose lives depended on him. Returning to the present, Frank looked at the faded patch as though staring at an old friend emerging from the dark. A small touch was enough to bring back the pain, the fear, the pride, and the promise he had carried for decades. Meanwhile, Mercer remained where he stood, oblivious to the change spreading across the room. He continued speaking with the tone of someone convinced he was winning. "Hard to believe the Navy hires someone like you. Standards really are dropping." But this time no one laughed. Eyes began to shift. Confusion crept onto the faces of several young sailors. They didn't know who Frank was, but they knew one thing for certain: no one deserved to be spoken to that way, especially an older man quietly doing his job with disarming humility. The silence grew heavier, deeper, as if the entire room was instinctively trying to protect something they hadn't fully understood yet. Chief Lauren Shaw, responsible for engineering operations, had been standing at the back the whole time. She watched without saying a word, her sharp eyes belonging to someone who had seen far more than Mercer could ever imagine. She wasn't angry. She wasn't irritated. She was simply quiet, in a way that suggested she had just recognized a crucial piece of the puzzle others had missed. Frank still didn't respond. He adjusted the grip on his spatula and stared at it as though searching for the familiar steadiness he had relied on all his life. His silence wasn't weakness. It was the silence of a man who had lost too much to waste breath on cheap insults. The more Mercer spoke, the more his arrogance swelled, but Frank's quiet dignity was what made those standing nearby uneasy. His silence held the weight of memories they had never lived. A few young sailors straightened their backs, not out of fear, but because instinct told them something was very wrong. The man before them was not just an old burger flipper. He carried a story, and it was far larger than any apron or plain shirt could hide. Lauren Shaw drew in a slow breath, and in that moment she knew exactly what would happen if someone didn't intervene. And from that realization, she quietly set into motion the first step of a chain of command that would change the entire story. Lauren Shaw stood at the far end of the mess hall, quietly observing the two men facing each other. She had witnessed plenty of tension between officers and civilian contractors before, but this had a different scent. Mercer wasn't just being disrespectful. He was pushing himself toward a dangerous line he didn't even realize existed. And Frank, the old man, stood motionless like a statue carved from years that none of them could begin to fathom. Shaw touched the small internal comm device hidden in her pocket and quickly keyed in a familiar sequence. She spoke softly, just enough for the watchstander on the other end to hear CDO. "This is Chief Shaw. I need verification on a name. Frank Calder." The voice on the other end sounded casual at first, the way someone sounds during a routine watch. But only seconds later it tightened, constricted, as if someone had gripped their throat. "Frank Calder. Confirm that name." Shaw repeated it slowly and clearly, and that alone was enough for the air inside the small watchroom to shift instantly. No one said it out loud, but anyone with years in the service understood there are certain names that if they appear on a ship, every level of command must move from routine to absolute seriousness. Frank Calder was one of those names. The call was pushed up the chain almost immediately. Less than half a minute later, in the executive officer's office, Commander Julia Reddick was reviewing reports when the internal line rang urgently. She lifted the receiver, and the strained whisper of the CDO reached her ear. "Ma'am, we have an incident involving civilian Frank Calder, requesting immediate response." Reddick's hand froze around her pen. The pen slipped from her fingers, rolled across the table, and came to a stop. She drew in a sharp breath and issued a single order: "Get the captain. Now." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to make the two junior officers in the room look at each other with a mix of worry and disbelief. Commander Reddick wasn't someone who panicked. If this were merely a civilian being disrespected, she would never have called for the captain so abruptly. But this wasn't just any civilian. Meanwhile, back in the mess hall, Mercer kept going. In his blind confidence, he slammed his hand against the counter and barked, "Get out of the galley, old man! Leave this area immediately!" A few young sailors flinched. Some changed expression. They didn't know what was happening on the upper deck, but they were beginning to sense that Mercer's arrogance was crossing a line he shouldn't cross. No one dared to intervene, but all of them hid behind the swelling silence as if waiting for something, or fearing something that was about to break loose. Shaw slid the comm device back into her pocket, her eyes sharp as a blade. She took a step toward Frank, saying nothing, but the alertness in her gaze was enough to make the sailors nearby instinctively step aside. She knew exactly what would happen once the chain of command heard that name, and she was preparing to soften the blow before it was too late. Not long after, footsteps echoed from the left corridor, starting as a brisk rhythm, then growing faster, firmer, more synchronized until the entire mess hall seemed to tense under it. Anyone with experience aboard a ship knew immediately these weren't normal footfalls. They belonged to security and senior officers moving with a tempo that tolerated no delay. Mercer heard the noise but misunderstood it entirely. He thought they were coming to handle the old man he had just ordered to leave. Emboldened, he straightened his posture and pointed toward Frank once more. "Let me repeat myself. Leave the service area now. I will be filing a report." But Frank didn't move. He simply looked down at the spatula in his hand, as though Mercer's insults couldn't reach him at all. It was precisely that silence, steady and unshaken, that stretched the room tight as a drawn wire waiting for the slightest pull to snap. Lauren Shaw knew that moment had arrived. She heard the metal door swing open with force in the hallway. She felt the rhythm of not one but several people approaching, and she understood with clarity whoever walked in next would hold absolute power to change everything. And when those footsteps stopped at the threshold of the mess hall, no one doubted any more that true authority had arrived. And from this moment onward, the story was entering an entirely different chapter. The mess hall door swung open with a sharp echo that made the entire room snap to attention on instinct. Captain Adrian Wolfe stepped inside, firm, commanding, carrying a presence so authoritative that no one dared to breathe too loudly. The air thickened instantly, stretched tight, like a string pulled to the point of breaking. Mercer immediately raised his hand in salute, his face bright with hope, convinced that his superior had finally arrived to deal with the old man he believed was useless. But Captain Wolfe didn't look at him. Not a glance. Not a flicker of acknowledgement. That disregard cut sharper than any reprimand. Every trace of the captain's focus went straight to Frank Calder. Frank stood there, still holding his worn spatula. The faded patch on his shoulder, which moments earlier had been the target of mockery, now seemed to radiate a quiet gravity, as if Wolfe's approach had awakened a meaning only the seasoned and the scarred could recognize. Wolfe stopped directly in front of Frank. He straightened his posture, every movement firm and exact. Without waiting for anyone to speak, he raised his hand in a crisp, formal salute, one so sharp, so respectful, no one could pretend not to feel the weight of it. "Code name Harbormaster. It's an honor, sir." A couple of young sailors nearly dropped their trays. Someone inhaled sharply, somewhere in the room, and fell silent again. Eyes widened as people tried to reconcile two images that didn't seem to fit together. A quiet old cook and a name they had only heard whispered in passing during training. Harbormaster. Not everyone recognized it. But those who had read deeper into naval history understood instantly this wasn't an ordinary call sign. It belonged to a man who had shifted the balance in a moment when the world was standing on the edge. Frank slowly lifted his hand to return the salute. Not fast, not forcefully, but with a precision that carried decades. It was the kind of movement that could only come from someone who had spent a lifetime under the Navy's flag. His slowness wasn't age. It was reverence returned to a commander who understood exactly who stood before him. When Frank lowered his hand, the mess hall froze in a moment that felt impossibly long. No one spoke. No one moved. They all sensed they were standing in the presence of something far greater than they had imagined. Mercer was nearly rigid. His lips trembled. His eyes flickered back and forth between Frank and Captain Wolf, trying to piece together a truth his heart wasn't ready for. Captain Wolf turned, fixing Mercer with a look not angry, not shouting, but cold enough to drop the temperature in the entire room. "Lieutenant Mercer, do you have any idea who he is?" The question was soft, but it carried the weight of a verdict. Mercer swallowed hard. His throat tightened. No sound came out, and that silence was the clearest answer of all. Wolf didn't need to raise his voice or offer more explanation. His gesture toward Frank said everything the man who had been insulted moments earlier was anything but ordinary. The captain's respect spoke louder than any speech could. Frank remained calm. His gaze softened as though the noise and chaos around him belonged to a world he had stepped away from long ago. He wasn't angry. He wasn't offended. He wasn't proud. He wore the quiet humility of someone who had lived through too much to ever feel the need to raise his voice. And when every pair of eyes finally turned toward him, Frank simply gave a small nod as if to remind them all that titles, legends, and old stories were not what he came here for. He came to do a simple job the same way he once held together far bigger things without seeking recognition. And in that solemn moment, Captain Wolf finally spoke, preparing to reveal something no one in the room was truly ready to hear. Executive Officer Julia Reddick was the first to break the silence. She stepped forward and spoke clearly, each word falling into the air like an order that allowed no argument. Frank Calder, former Strategic Coordination Officer, the man who saved an entire task group during the Cuban Crisis. The younger sailors in the mess hall froze as if they had misheard. But Reddick didn't stop. The truth had been buried too long and needed to be spoken fully today. And Captain Wolf, who understood better than anyone the weight carried by that name, followed immediately. He once guided a task force through a storm strong enough to swallow destroyers whole. No radar, no compass, nothing but the instinct and courage of a true sailor. The entire room sank into silence as deep as an open well. No one shifted. No one breathed too loudly. Only the tight, stunned breaths of those who realized they were standing painfully close to a living piece of naval history. Hands tightened into fists. A few young sailors straightened unconsciously, as though respect were the only reflex they could possibly have at that moment. They understood that the man before them wasn't a cook, not really. He was a flesh-and-blood symbol, someone the history books mentioned only in small lines, but with enough weight to move an entire generation. Mercer could barely keep himself standing. His voice trembled thin and weak. "Sir, I didn't know. I really didn't know." Captain Wolf looked at him. He didn't raise his voice yet. There was not a shred of softness in his tone. "And it is because you didn't know that you allowed arrogance to blind you." The sentence didn't strike Mercer like a reprimand. It landed like a verdict for ignorance, for pride, for forgetting the simplest principle a young officer must carry: respect those who carve the path before you. Frank Calder remained where he was. He wasn't proud, wasn't triumphant. He simply watched Mercer with the eyes of a man who had witnessed hundreds of young sailors grow up and falter and rise again. He knew Mercer's remorse wasn't fake. It was a blow straight to the heart of his own dignity. But sometimes that is precisely what makes a person finally grow. Frank didn't speak right away. He placed a finger on the faded patch on his shoulder, touching it the way someone touches an old memory. Years ago in that storm when part of the world held its breath in fear of a war breaking out, he had sat amid howling wind and groaning metal, calculating each deviation by sheer instinct. No light, no signal, only the weight of responsibility for the men who followed behind him. And now in this small mess hall, he saw another young man who needed the same reminder he had once received from the generation before him. A reminder not taught through harshness, but through dignity. Frank finally spoke, his voice low, calm, but carrying unmistakable force. "No one knows everything, Lieutenant, but a soldier must know when to listen and when to learn again." His words weren't meant to humiliate Mercer. They were meant to open a door, to hand him a chance, to give him one breath of space in which pride no longer crushed him. The other sailors exchanged glances. No one spoke, but everyone understood they had just witnessed something rare, a legend speaking about responsibility, with compassion, not authority. Captain Wolf exhaled quietly, as if lifting a weight off his shoulders. "Harbormaster has nothing left to prove. But you, Mercer, you must prove that you deserve the uniform you wear." The words landed in the center of the room loudly, but with enough gravity to make Mercer bow his head even deeper. He realized now that his mistake wasn't insulting an old cook. It was insulting memory sacrifice and the countless souls lost in places he had never seen. And in the silence that followed, something else began to take shape, something only veterans who have stood at the edge between life and death could ever pass on to those still too young to understand. Mercer bowed his head so low, it was as if he wanted to hide from his own shadow. He tried to speak, but the words came out fractured, like a man who had just lost the most important part of his life in uniform. "I'm sorry, Mr. Calder. I failed the uniform." The mess hall, once noisy, now held only the faint breaths of people who understood that this moment was far larger than a simple apology. Frank looked at Mercer with eyes free of anger and free of blame. He placed a hand on the young officer's shoulder, a hand aged by years yet steady like the anchor of an entire generation before him. "Then honor it, from this day forward." Mercer closed his eyes for a brief second, and when he opened them again, the arrogance that once surrounded him had slipped away. He didn't just hear Frank's words, he absorbed them, through the layers of pride, youth, and stubbornness that military training sometimes can't shape fast enough. Frank withdrew his hand and continued, each word landing heavily in the quiet air. "On that stormy night, I learned one thing. Judgment saves lives. Ego sinks ships." A few of the younger sailors nearby shivered. Not because Frank raised his voice, he didn't, but because the truth in his words dropped straight into their chests like a stone. They had never heard a lesson delivered so plainly, because it wasn't a lecture from a classroom. This was the conclusion of a man who once held the lives of an entire task group in his hands. Frank went on, his voice deeper, slower, and unforgettable. "Out at sea, no one cares what rank you wear. The ocean only cares whether you have enough clarity, not to drag others down with you." Mercer inhaled sharply, as if trying to hold on to every syllable. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. Anyone could see the awakening in his eyes. The arrogance was gone. The defensiveness gone. What remained was an honest shame and a genuine desire to make things right. Frank watched him a moment longer, then turned back toward the galley. He lifted the spatula and flipped a lightly burned patty. A simple action, yet far more meaningful than any speech. As if he were saying that life and honor aren't found in grand gestures, but in doing each small thing with the right heart. No one in the mess hall spoke, but every person felt the weight of what had just occurred. A young officer had been brought back to where he needed to be. A veteran had passed on something no manual could teach, and the silence that filled the room was no longer awkward or tense, it was reverence. From the back, Captain Wolfe watched without stepping in. He understood better than most that some conversations belong only between two generations, no witnesses needed. And today, Frank had done what even a commanding officer sometimes cannot lead through dignity. Frank set the spatula down on the counter, his fingers tapping lightly on the surface, a habit from years spent calculating a ship's path through storms. His gaze was calm like an ocean after the winds settle. He didn't look at Mercer again, but everyone could sense that the exchange had ended in the best way it possibly could. Once more, silence wrapped around the room like a blanket over shifting thoughts. The young sailors knew that this moment would be retold for years, a reminder of the dignity their uniform demanded. And in that stillness, the echo of Frank's lesson spread quietly, guiding the ship toward its final, meaningful chapter. After that day, everything on the ship seemed to shift into a different current. The Navy quietly issued a new regulation emphasizing how to treat civilian personnel, and especially the veterans who returned to serve as volunteers. The policy appeared without ceremony, without loud announcements, but everyone knew it was born from that suffocating moment of silence in the mess hall when an old man flipping burgers had forced an entire system to look at itself again. Mercer was reassigned shortly after the incident. Not as punishment, but as a path designed for him to start over leadership respect, the dignity of the uniform, and the understanding that sometimes history stands right in front of you, you're just too busy to see it. He accepted the decision in silence without protest. For the first time, he understood that what he needed to learn wasn't in a textbook, it was in his attitude. A few weeks later, a small plaque was installed next to the galley, where Frank still stood every day flipping patties with the same patience and quiet steadiness. The plaque carried only a few simple words, heavier than any medal on a wall. Codename Harbormaster, respect those who served. No patterns, no gold frame, no decorative lights. Just an honest reminder to anyone passing by, respect is not an act performed to be seen. It's a principle that must never be forgotten. Mercer returned to the galley on the night before he left the ship. There was no arrogance in him anymore, no indifferent stare of someone who believed he knew everything. He simply walked up, stood beside Frank for a long moment, searching for the right words. When he found them, he exhaled soft but sincere, "I came to say goodbye, and to say I'll try to live in a way that's more worthy." Frank looked at him neither surprised nor emotional, only carrying the quiet generosity of a man who had watched many young sailors pass through his life. He placed a hand on Mercer's shoulder the same way he had when giving him a second chance. Create your own legend, son. Earn your legend. No more words were needed. Mercer nodded for the first time with genuine humility. He understood that the advice wasn't just for him. It was for every young service member who entered the military, with bright eyes, full of confidence, but not yet enough depth. Then he walked away, leaving behind the steady rhythm of Frank's spatula against the grill, a simple sound that in later years would echo in his memory, like a reminder of dignity. That night, as Frank cleaned his tools, the light caught the faded Thunderbird patch on his shoulder. The dim glow revealed every rough stitch, every frayed edge, as if the storms of long-ago seas were still alive in its threads. No long tales needed, no achievements recited. The patch had already told everything it told of those who quietly held the fleet together, held the generations that followed, in ways only men like Frank truly understood. In that silence, legacy was no longer shining medals or heroic pages in history books. Legacy was the way people treated one another, the respect given to hands that once trembled from cold winds on a ship's deck, the lessons left by those who came before, not through speeches, but through the life they lived. And for many on that ship, Harbormaster would forever be the reminder that some heroes never need to stand under bright lights. They simply stand where they believe is right. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please, share this video and subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten. Brave Veteran Stories. We remember the quiet heroes,